Imagine spending years believing that love means bending, softening, dissolving your own edges until there's nothing left to push against. Imagine believing that the way to keep someone close is to make yourself as agreeable, as available, as endlessly accommodating as possible, only to watch that exact strategy fail every single time with someone avoidant. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. And more importantly, you've been operating on a theory of love that works against you, specifically with someone whose entire nervous system is built around self-protection. There's a single shift, a specific kind of boundary, that changes almost everything about how an avoidant person experiences connection with you. It's not a trick. It's not manipulation dressed up as psychology. It's something far more fundamental, something that goes against nearly every instinct you've probably been following up to this point. And once you understand why it works, you'll never look at boundaries the same way again. Let's talk about what's actually happening beneath the surface when someone avoidant experiences a partner who has no real boundaries at all. Picture for a moment standing at the edge of something with no visible bottom, no walls, nothing solid to orient yourself against. That's often what limitless accommodation feels like from the avoidant side of the equation, even though it's rarely described in these terms. Without boundaries, there's nothing stable to push against, nothing that tells the nervous system where the edges of the relationship actually are. And a relationship without discernible edges doesn't feel safe. It feels formless, unpredictable, strangely more threatening than a relationship with clear, consistent structure. This might seem completely backwards from what you'd expect. Wouldn't someone who fears closeness prefer a partner who never pushes back, never asks for anything difficult, never risks conflict by holding a firm line? In the short term, maybe. But over time, something different happens. Limitless accommodation starts to feel less like safety and more like quicksand, something that could swallow an entire sense of self if stepped into carelessly. And an avoidant nervous system, already hyper-aware of losing itself in closeness, reads that quicksand as exactly the danger it spent a lifetime trying to avoid. Now let's talk about what a genuine, well-held boundary actually communicates, because this is where everything starts to shift. A boundary, stated clearly and maintained consistently, tells someone something they rarely encounter elsewhere. Here is a person who will not disappear into me. Here is a person whose sense of self remains intact, regardless of how close we get. Here is a person who won't need me to hold together their entire emotional world, because they've already demonstrated the capacity to hold their own. This single piece of information does something remarkable to an avoidant nervous system. It removes one of the deepest fears sitting underneath their entire pattern of retreat. The fear of becoming responsible for someone else's well-being, of being needed so completely that their own autonomy gets consumed in the process. A person with genuine boundaries cannot be consumed that easily. Their edges remain visible, even during closeness, and visible edges, paradoxically, make closeness feel considerably safer rather than more threatening. Let's get specific about what this boundary actually looks like in practice, because vague principles rarely translate into anything usable without concrete understanding of the underlying mechanism. The core of it involves a willingness to state clearly what you need, and then crucially, to follow through with real consequences when those needs consistently go unmet, rather than simply expressing disappointment and continuing to show up exactly as available as before. This distinction matters enormously. Most people, especially those who've spent significant time loving someone avoidant, become skilled at expressing hurt, frustration, disappointment. What they rarely develop is the harder skill of actually adjusting their own behavior in response to that hurt going unaddressed. Saying, "I need more consistency," while continuing to offer unconditional availability regardless of whether consistency ever materializes, teaches an avoidant nervous system something specific: that words and boundaries don't actually correspond to real consequences, that everything remains negotiable indefinitely. A genuine boundary works completely differently. It says implicitly, if not always explicitly, that certain behavior will change your own behavior in return. not as punishment, not as manipulation, but as a natural, honest consequence of what actually feels sustainable for you to continue offering. This might look like genuinely reducing availability when consistency isn't being reciprocated, not as a calculated strategy to provoke a reaction, but as an authentic response to your own changing capacity to keep offering the same level of investment into something that isn't being met halfway. Here's why this specific dynamic tends to affect avoidant partners so profoundly, more than almost any other single shift you could make. Remember that control sits at the very heart of avoidant psychology. Not control over other people exactly, but control over the pace and terms of closeness itself. For most of their relational history, that control has belonged entirely to them, exercised through withdrawal, through inconsistency, through determining unilaterally how close or distant the connection would be at any given moment. A genuine boundary redistributes that control, not aggressively, not as a power struggle, but simply by introducing another variable into the equation, one that doesn't depend entirely on their comfort level to determine the shape of the relationship. This redistribution often produces something unexpected: increased respect, increased attraction, sometimes even increased anxiety about losing access to someone who clearly won't wait indefinitely for reciprocity that never arrives. Avoidant people, despite their fear of closeness, are rarely drawn to partners who demonstrate no capacity for self protection. Something in their own psychology, built around self sufficiency as a core value, recognizes and respects that same self sufficiency when it appears in someone else, even when that recognition initially produces discomfort rather than immediate warmth. Let's talk about why this particular dynamic feels so counterintuitive to enact, especially for anyone who has spent significant time in a relationship pattern built around chasing, appeasing, and accommodating. Holding a genuine boundary requires tolerating real discomfort, specifically the discomfort of potentially losing someone by asking for something they might not be willing or able to provide. This is precisely the discomfort most people try hardest to avoid when loving someone avoidant, because the fear of losing them entirely often feels more unbearable than the ongoing pain of inconsistency itself. This is exactly why so few people ever actually implement genuine boundaries with an avoidant partner, even when they intellectually understand the concept. Understanding that a boundary is necessary is not the same as having the emotional capacity to hold one when it's actually tested, when the possibility of real loss becomes concrete rather than theoretical. Building that capacity requires its own kind of internal work that has nothing directly to do with the avoidant partner at all, and everything to do with your own relationship to your own worth, your own tolerance for discomfort, your own belief that you deserve consistency, even if holding that standard costs you the relationship entirely. There's something important to acknowledge here. Holding a genuine boundary with someone avoidant does not guarantee they'll respond by finally offering the consistency and closeness you've been hoping for. Sometimes it works exactly as described, producing a genuine shift in how the relationship unfolds, activating precisely the kind of respect and safety that allows an avoidant partner to finally show up more fully. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the boundary simply reveals, clearly and definitively, that this particular person isn't currently capable of meeting you there, regardless of how well communicated or well held your boundary actually was. This uncertain outcome is not a flaw in the approach. It's simply an honest reflection of reality. Boundaries reveal truth. They don't manufacture desired outcomes. A boundary tells you, with real clarity, what someone is actually capable of offering, as opposed to what hopeful interpretation of their occasional warmth might have led you to believe they were capable of. That clarity is valuable, regardless of which direction it points, because it replaces prolonged uncertainty with genuine information. Information you can actually use to make an informed decision about how to move forward. Let's talk about the specific quality of a boundary that makes it effective versus the version that often backfires, because there's an important distinction here worth understanding clearly. A boundary rooted in genuine self respect, communicated calmly, without excessive emotional charge, tends to land completely differently than a boundary delivered as an ultimatum, born from desperation or anger. The words might be nearly identical in both cases. The energy underneath them, the place they're actually coming from, is what determines whether they read as grounded self respect or as another form of pressure, another attempt to control someone else's behavior through emotional intensity rather than genuine internal clarity. This is why the internal work matters so much more than the specific script or wording you might use to communicate a boundary. A boundary spoken from a place of genuine security, from a place that has already accepted the real possibility of loss and found that acceptance survivable, carries a fundamentally different quality than a boundary spoken while still desperately hoping it will produce a specific outcome. Avoidant people, remember, are often unusually skilled at detecting the difference between genuine groundedness and disguised desperation, having spent so much of their own life managing and hiding their own internal states from others. That same skill, turned outward, makes them remarkably attuned to whether your boundary comes from real strength or from fear wearing the costume of strength. I want to address something important about timing and pacing here too, because boundaries introduced too early, before genuine trust and understanding have had time to develop, often land very differently than boundaries introduced within an already established relationship built on some foundation of care. This doesn't mean early boundaries are wrong or shouldn't be held. It simply means the specific effect we've been discussing, the deepening of respect and safety that can occur when an avoidant partner encounters genuine boundaries, tends to develop more reliably within relationships that already have some existing foundation to build on, rather than functioning as a magic formula capable of transforming any connection, regardless of its underlying health or viability. Let's go deeper into the mechanics of why edgeless love reads as danger rather than devotion, because this deserves more than a passing metaphor. Think about how trust actually develops between two nervous systems over time. Trust isn't built primarily through grand gestures or declarations. It's built through prediction, through the accumulated experience of being able to anticipate, with reasonable accuracy, how someone will respond in a given situation. A person with clear, consistent boundaries is predictable in exactly this way. You know roughly what they'll tolerate and what they won't. You know the shape of the relationship because that shape has visible outlines. A person without boundaries offers no such predictability, and this absence, however well intentioned, actually undermines the very safety it's trying to create. If someone will tolerate anything, accommodate anything, forgive anything without any shift in their own behavior, there's no way to know what actually matters to them, no way to calibrate your own actions against a stable reference point. This creates a strange, disorienting kind of uncertainty, one that doesn't feel like freedom the way it might seem it should. It feels like standing in a room with no walls, unable to tell where you actually are in relation to anything solid. This matters enormously for understanding why boundaries specifically, rather than simple warmth or affection, tend to produce such a distinct shift in how avoidant partners experience a relationship. Warmth without structure can feel wonderful in the moment, but it doesn't provide the kind of stable reference point a fearful nervous system actually needs in order to relax. Structure, even when it introduces the possibility of friction or disappointment, provides exactly that stability. Paradoxically, the presence of real limits often creates more safety than the absence of limits ever could, because limits give the relationship an actual shape worth trusting. Let's talk about something specific and practical. How to distinguish a boundary from a threat, because this distinction trips up a lot of people attempting this shift for the first time. A boundary describes your own actions. A threat describes consequences aimed at controlling someone else's actions. The difference sounds subtle in language, but feels completely different in practice. Saying, if you keep pulling away, I'll leave, functions primarily as a threat, an attempt to control someone else's behavior through fear of loss. Saying, I'm not able to keep offering this level of consistency if it isn't reciprocated, so I'm going to start protecting my own time and energy differently, functions as a boundary, a description of your own adjusted behavior rather than a demand aimed at controlling theirs. This distinction matters because threats tend to produce short-term compliance, followed by resentment or further withdrawal, while genuine boundaries tend to produce something closer to respect, even when that respect initially arrives wrapped in discomfort or even anger. Nobody enjoys encountering a boundary that limits access to something they wanted, even inconsistently. But there's a difference between resenting a boundary and disrespecting the person holding it. And genuine boundaries, communicated as descriptions of your own needs rather than demands placed on someone else, tend to preserve respect, even when they produce short-term friction. Let's address something that deserves real, honest attention. The fear that holding a boundary will simply drive an avoidant partner away permanently, confirming every anxious thought that's likely accompanied you through this entire process. This fear is not irrational. Sometimes boundaries do result in someone leaving, and there's no way to guarantee in advance which outcome you'll encounter with any specific person. But it's worth examining what the alternative actually offers, because the alternative isn't really safety either, despite how it might feel in the short term. Continuing without boundaries doesn't prevent loss, it simply delays a different kind of loss, the slow, cumulative loss of your own sense of self, your own confidence, your own belief that you deserve reciprocity rather than perpetual one-sided accommodation. Many people who avoid holding boundaries with an avoidant partner do eventually lose that relationship anyway, often after years of additional erosion to their own well-being, arriving at the same ending they were originally trying to prevent, but considerably more depleted by the time they get there. Holding a boundary doesn't guarantee a better outcome regarding the relationship itself, but it does guarantee a better outcome regarding your own preserved sense of self throughout the process, regardless of how the relationship ultimately resolves. There's something worth saying about the specific emotional experience of holding a boundary for the first time with someone who has grown accustomed to unlimited access. This often produces an immediate, sometimes intense reaction, not necessarily anger, but a kind of unsettled confusion, almost as though the ground has shifted beneath a dynamic they'd come to rely on without ever consciously examining it. This reaction can feel discouraging if you're expecting immediate positive response, immediate gratitude, immediate softening. That's rarely what happens right away. The initial response to a new boundary is often destabilization, precisely because it disrupts an established pattern, even a pattern that wasn't actually serving anyone particularly well. This initial destabilization doesn't mean the boundary was wrong or poorly executed. It simply means change, even positive change, tends to produce short-term discomfort before any longer-term benefit becomes visible. Holding steady through that initial discomfort, without immediately retreating back into old patterns the moment the response isn't instantly warm and receptive, is often exactly what determines whether the boundary produces genuine long-term shift or simply becomes another example of a limit that eventually got abandoned under pressure. Let's talk, finally, about what happens on the other side of successfully holding a boundary over time, because this deserves real attention too, not just the difficult initial phase. When a boundary gets held consistently, without wavering under pressure or guilt, something often begins to shift in how an avoidant partner relates to the entire relationship. The unpredictability that once characterized their own behavior starts to feel matched, mirrored even, by a new kind of unpredictability regarding your own responses, one rooted not in instability, but in genuine self-respect. This mirroring often produces a strange, unexpected effect: increased effort on their part, increased consistency, increased willingness to risk vulnerability, precisely because the relationship no longer feels like something they can take for granted, regardless of their own level of investment. This shift, when it happens, rarely announces itself dramatically. It tends to arrive gradually through small, consistent changes in behavior that accumulate over weeks and months, rather than appearing overnight in response to a single firm conversation. Recognizing this gradual shift requires the same patience and honest observation discussed earlier, resisting the urge to expect immediate transformation, while still paying careful attention to whether genuine, sustained change is actually occurring over time. Let's bring this entire discussion back towards something essential, something that deserves to be the true center of everything we've discussed, rather than a footnote at the end. This boundary, this capacity to hold your own edges clearly and consistently, was never really meant to be a strategy for making someone else fall in love with you. That framing, however useful it might be for understanding avoidant psychology specifically, risks missing the deeper point entirely. Genuine boundaries are not a technique. They are simply what self-respect looks like in practice, what a whole, secure sense of self naturally produces, regardless of who happens to be standing on the other side of the relationship. Let's talk about something that rarely gets addressed directly, but shapes almost everything about whether this entire shift succeeds or fails: your own relationship to guilt. Holding a boundary, especially with someone you genuinely care about, someone whose withdrawal you understand at least partially stems from real fear rather than malice, tends to activate guilt almost immediately. That guilt whispers something specific and persuasive: that asking for reciprocity is selfish, that protecting your own energy somehow constitutes abandonment, that a truly loving person would simply continue giving, regardless of what comes back in return. This guilt deserves to be examined honestly, rather than simply pushed aside, because pushing it aside without understanding it tends to leave it operating quietly in the background anyway, undermining boundaries even while you're consciously trying to hold them. The guilt usually traces back to a deeply held belief that your own worth depends on how much you're willing to give. Once you can see the guilt as something learned rather than objectively true about how relationships are supposed to work, it becomes easier to hold a boundary despite it. Let's talk about something related, something that often complicates this process significantly: the specific confusion between compassion and self-erasure. So much of understanding avoidant psychology involves genuine compassion, recognizing the fear underneath the withdrawal, the old wounds shaping the pattern, the genuine internal suffering that often accompanies someone else's inability to stay close. This compassion is valuable and worth maintaining, but compassion for someone else's wound was never meant to require erasing your own needs entirely in service of managing that wound indefinitely. There's a specific trap worth naming clearly here: mistaking your own boundarylessness for evidence of how compassionate or understanding you are. Some people, especially those drawn toward loving avoidant partners in the first place, develop a kind of identity around being endlessly patient, endlessly understanding, endlessly capable of absorbing difficult behavior without complaint. This identity can feel virtuous, even noble, but it often functions as a subtle form of self-abandonment, dressed up as generosity. True compassion includes compassion for yourself. A framework that only extends understanding outward, never inward, isn't actually complete compassion. It's imbalanced generosity. And imbalanced generosity tends to be unsustainable, regardless of how well-intentioned it originally was. Let's explore something worth understanding in detail: what actually happens internally, moment to moment, when you first attempt to hold a boundary after a long history of not holding one? There's often an initial surge of anxiety, sometimes intense enough to feel almost physically overwhelming, a kind of visceral fear that stating this limit will result in immediate, catastrophic loss. This anxiety isn't irrational exactly, even if it's often disproportionate to what actually happens next. It reflects genuine uncertainty about an outcome you can't fully predict or control. Working through this anxiety requires a conscious reminder that discomfort doesn't equal danger, and surviving the anxiety of holding a limit is itself evidence of capacity. Over time, this anxiety tends to decrease with repeated practice. The first time feels nearly unbearable. The second time, slightly less so. Eventually, holding boundaries becomes simply how you operate by default, a natural extension of self-respect. This shift doesn't happen overnight, and deserves patience with yourself. Let's turn towards something important regarding communication style, because how a boundary gets expressed matters almost as much as the boundary itself, particularly with someone whose nervous system is already primed to interpret intensity as danger. There's a significant difference between stating a boundary once, clearly and calmly, and repeating that same boundary multiple times with increasing emotional intensity when it doesn't initially produce the desired response. The former tends to land as genuine self respect. The latter often starts to resemble exactly the kind of pursuit and pressure that triggers further retreat, rather than the safety and respect a well held boundary is actually meant to produce. This distinction matters because many people, especially in the anxious early stages of learning to hold boundaries, fall into a pattern of essentially negotiating their own limits, restating them repeatedly, adding justification, seeking validation that the boundary is reasonable, essentially asking permission to hold a limit rather than simply holding it. This repeated negotiation undermines the very stability a boundary is supposed to provide, because it signals, despite the words themselves, that the limit is actually still up for discussion, still dependent on receiving enough agreement or understanding from the other person before it becomes real. A genuinely held boundary doesn't require extensive justification or repeated explanation. It gets stated once, clearly, and then it simply becomes true through consistent action, regardless of whether the other person fully agrees with or understands the reasoning behind it. This doesn't mean refusing all further conversation about it. It means the boundary itself doesn't depend on winning that conversation in order to remain valid and operative in your own behavior. Let's talk about what it means to move through the period when you first hold a boundary and the response isn't what you were hoping for, because this period deserves real attention. Disappointment, frustration, even anger at seeing someone pull away harder rather than finally relent might surface. These feelings are legitimate and deserve acknowledgement, but they're not signs that the boundary was wrong. They're simply signs that holding a boundary has consequences. And one of those consequences is that not everyone will respond by stepping closer. Some will step further away. And that outcome, however painful, still provides valuable information about what's actually sustainable for you long term in this particular relationship. That's a genuine, real effect worth understanding. But the boundary itself remains worth holding, regardless of that specific outcome, because it protects something more fundamental than any particular relationship success: your own capacity to remain whole, intact, and self respecting, no matter who you're loving or how that love ultimately unfolds. That capacity is the real prize here, far more valuable than any specific person's response could ever be. Holding a boundary was never meant to be a strategy. It was always meant to be a foundation, a return to yourself, a way of honoring your own wholeness, regardless of whether anyone else eventually learns to respect it.